Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, video games boomed onto the scene with arcades and home consoles such as the Atari 2600 and the Nintendo Entertainment System. With this sudden explosion came a great amount of controversy over the number of violent games that were being produced for children to play. One of the earliest examples of this was in 1976 with the release of Death Race, a top-down arcade game where the player's goal is to run over pedestrians with a car. Parents were alarmed, claiming that it would make their kids more violent. 16 years later, in 1992, the controversy changed forever with the release of the infamous fighting game Mortal Kombat.
Kids relish their victory and their bloody choice. Should they pull out their opponent's heart or simply rip his head off just to see his spinal cord dangle in a pool of blood?
Countless parents across the country slammed the game for years on end, calling it violent and calling for it to be banned. In this time, more and more violent video games, such as 1993's Doom, continued to pop up. In 1994, after years of controversy surrounding violent video games being easily accessible to kids, the Entertainment Software Rating Board, the ESRB, was founded by the Interactive Digital Software Association, renamed to the Entertainment Software Association in 2004, to put age ratings on all new games that came out. At this time, there were 5 age ratings: EC for early childhood, K to A for kids to adults, T for teen, M for mature, and AO for adults only. These ratings were put on the box cover of video games in the United States, with almost every store that sold video games choosing to follow them and restricting the games that children could purchase and play. This was meant to mitigate the enragement of concerned parents. In spite of this, the controversy surrounding violent video games has not died down since those early days of Mortal Kombat. Some might actually argue that it's more prevalent now than ever before, with the rise of online multiplayer shooters such as Fortnite and Call of Duty. It's gotten to the point where even some present-day politicians are starting to call them out for having an impact on our youth.
My colleagues and so many of the advocates from around the country, we are determined to stop a situation in which video games with pornographic and violent content are being peddled to our children.
We have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it, and also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
And with our country seemingly becoming more violent, especially with the plethora of mass shootings that have been almost commonplace in our country, it's not difficult to see where this argument is stemming from today. As the debate rages on, however, it seems that neither side is willing to budge on their views. On one hand, you have the side that is so certain that video games are contributing to our apparent rise in violence that they aren't willing to listen to the other side. The same goes for people who play video games, with their knee-jerk reaction being that they themselves aren't violent people. The problem with both arguments is that neither of them present evidence that isn't biased or anecdotal. So, as someone who has played video games himself and knows plenty of other people who have, that begs the question of me: are video games truly to blame for making people as a whole more violent? The goal for this video is to remain entirely impartial. Obviously, it's hard to set aside my own personal beliefs, but it has to be done in order for me to present viable information and arguments from both sides of this very controversial coin. When talking about the concept of video games being associated with violent crimes, I think it's important to acknowledge the difference between correlation and causation, because these two terms often get confused when it comes to this data. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the definition of correlation is, quote, the state or relation of being correlated, while causation is, quote, the act or agency which produces an effect. What this means is that just because two things may be connected to each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that one thing causes the other. So now, with that out of the way, let's take a closer look at how both of these play into the matter at hand. If video games did cause violent acts to happen, then we could expect to find a strong correlation between individuals who commit violent acts and individuals who play violent games. This means that we can expect at least the majority of mass shooters, for example, to regularly play these types of video games. According to a report published by KXAN, which is a subsidiary of NBC in Austin, Texas, only about 20% of mass shooters from 1992 to 2022 were reported to have a strong connection to the hobby of gaming. Quote, according to the Violence Project Research, a National Institute of Justice-funded project which aimed to profile mass shooters, 26 of the 136 mass shooters since 1992 played violent video games. That's just under 20%, end quote. What this data is saying is that there's almost very little correlation between people who play violent video games and people who actually commit real-world violence. This point of correlation is also backed up by a research report by psychologist Christopher Ferguson, who said in his journal, quote, "Despite claims from some scholars that violent media might explain as much as 30% of societal violence, some scholars began to note that the video game era saw approximately a 2/3 reduction in youth violence, not an increase, which appeared to conflict with some of the statements of harm, at least on the societal level." This goes to show that despite many academic and trustworthy sources saying that video games do cause violence, there are still many out there that say otherwise. In spite of this, it's also important to acknowledge the fact that many reputable sources, such as the American Psychological Association, have said in previous reports that video games do cause people to become more violent. So perhaps the question we should be asking isn't whether or not it's making people in general more violent, but rather making certain individuals more violent or prone to violent tendencies. This is actually the question that game theory's Matthew Patrick asked in his video regarding this topic. In his video, he states that out of the 18 mass shootings where 10 or more people were killed from 1999 to 2019, only 4 of the shooters were reported to have video games play a big role in their lives.
Of the 18 incidents that I mentioned earlier that had more than 10 deaths, my research actually tells me that only 4 of those shooters actually had noteworthy video game habits. There are plenty of explanations for that, but it all aligns with a report issued by the Secret Service back in 2002, which indicated that only 12% of school shooters expressed any sort of interest in violent video games.
According to this data, there is no causal evidence that shooters are driven by the violence present in what they play. Just because correlation and causation aren't represented with this data doesn't necessarily mean that video games aren't the cause of violent acts. However, they do represent a pretty strong connection to games not being the thing to blame here. If video games truly were the cause of these specific individuals randomly snapping and deciding to commit a violent crime, then we could expect the percentage amongst those who have committed such acts who have played violent games to be much higher than what various reports have stated. There's also the fact that if video games truly did cause an increase in widespread violence, then we could expect to see the popularity of some of the more famous violent games coinciding with the stats of real-world violent crimes such as shootings. This is actually not the case. When looking at crime data from 1990 through 2021, you'll actually see crime statistics going down over the course of the 30-year window. Adjusted for a population of 100,000 people, we see a drop from 758.2 crimes per 100,000 people in 1990 to a low of 361.6 in 2014, with it remaining relatively low since then. This is in contrast to the rising popularity of violent video games. Today, the global video game industry is worth over $300 billion according to multiple sources. This growth has been brought on by video games and the systems to play them being more accessible today than ever before, especially with the rise of mobile gaming. In terms of timeline, it just simply does not make sense for popularity in violent games to be spurring on violent crimes. Blaming games for violence also doesn't make sense when you compare the United States to other countries. While the US is the largest country in the world in terms of video game consumption, we aren't exactly alone in our love for games. What we are unique in is our record of gun violence. According to a study by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which was published by Statista in 2019, the US has a video game industry of $36.9 billion, which is followed closely by China at $36.5 billion, then Japan at $19 billion, South Korea at $6.2 billion, Germany at a flat $6 billion, the UK at $5.6 billion, France at $5.1 billion, and Canada at $2.8 billion. According to that same study, the US has an approximate 4.43 gun violence deaths per 100,000 people. China, on the other hand, despite being right behind the US with how big its video game industry is, only has 0.04 gun deaths per 100,000 people. The other 6 of the top 8 countries have rates ranging from 0.04 to 0.47. Combined, these don't even make up a quarter of the gun death ratio that we see here in the United States. Here's where this last data point may become negated, however. Those 7 other countries have much tighter gun laws than here in the States, with some countries such as China and Japan restricting firearm ownership for almost all individual persons. This is where taking into account biases really helps with this type of research. Obviously, those countries have much lower gun violence rates because they don't allow individuals to own and carry guns in the same way that we do here. But this report does not come out and directly say that, because it's trying to prove a point by manipulating its data to present itself in a desirable fashion. While I'm not saying that this data, or at least the point it's trying to make, is entirely false, it definitely does raise my eyebrows for being misleading, especially since this report does not take into account other violent crimes such as rape, stabbings, or assault. Overall though, despite this data having a heavy possibility of bias, the other data that we get does not show a strong correlation between violent video games and violent crime rates. While video games can definitely present some pretty violent themes, I find it hard to believe that if they actually do cause violence, then they're the only thing doing so. Sure, video games are certainly more interactive than something you'd watch on the TV, since you are the one piloting your character through the violent actions. Sometimes you even get to choose to perform said actions. Despite this, there are many examples of movies and TV shows being just as violent, if not more so, than their video game counterparts. So what about them? If the media we're consuming is truly making us more violent, then how do violent films factor into everything, especially when that medium of entertainment is often more widely known than that of games? How do video games compare to movies? Well, according to a study done and published by psychologists Patrick Markey, Juliana French, and Charlotte Markey, it actually showed a pretty similar correlation between the popularity of violent media and crime statistics that we saw earlier with video games. Since 1985, as the popularity of violent themes in PG-13 movies continued to climb, violent crime rates have actually declined overall, reaching their peak in the early 90s and slowly tapering off since then. With this and the previous evidence that we have seen showing little to no connection between violent media and increases in violent crimes, it simply seems like instantly pointing the blame to video games seems unjustified. Because if they did cause violence, then that fact would be reflected through a strong correlation of violent crime being spurred on by some of history's most famous violent games. And it would also, in theory at least, mirror similar statistics with other forms of violent media, such as movies. In total, it would seem that video games do not cause violent tendencies in people, especially not on a societal level. Even with specific individuals, it seems as though video games do not cause them to just randomly snap, as seen with the very low percentage of mass shooters saying that they regularly played video games. Granted, this doesn't mean that video games are great for you or even necessarily good for you. There are still plenty of other things to worry about, such as whether or not certain games are causing us to have lower attention spans. What I am saying though is that according to the data, there is very little evidence to back up the claims that video games lead to people becoming more violent. Thank you all for watching.